on behalf of the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, I just want to welcome you all today and say thank you for joining. We have a number of high-level attendees and speakers, and we are just so excited to have you join us for this interactive session with both global as well as local and student leaders. So thank you all so much for joining. My name is Noah Gaffney. I am the Executive Director for the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, and I come from a primarily global background. I started my career as a social entrepreneur, have lived and worked all around the world, working for organizations like the World Economic Forum and the United Nations Foundation through an organization that I founded, and really grateful to have the CEO, the former CEO of that organization here with us today as our keynote speaker. I actually came back to the United States to take on this role at Rutgers because I am so excited by what we are doing here at the RIXI. This is an opportunity for us to share these global best practices with local students and leaders. And as you all know, Rutgers is one of the most diverse campuses on the country. And so this is just a fantastic opportunity to share this ability for students to make an impact through their work and to connect them with business leaders that have been leading the way on this for decades through corporations like Samsung, Johnson & Johnson, Becton Dickinson, Novo Nordisk, and a number of our other partners, past and present, who are here with us today. So thank you all so much. I'm just going to run a brief overview of the day, so walk you briefly through the agenda. So we'll be kicking off with remarks from Dean Lei Lei, who is the Dean of Rutgers Business School. Thank you so much for joining us, Dean Lei. She'll hand it off to Rutgers President Holloway, who is also here with us. And as I mentioned, our keynote speaker will be Kathy Calvin, the former president of the United Nations Foundation, followed by an overview of a report that our students wrote. So the impetus for this conversation today is actually a report that was driven by our students. They interviewed our corporate partners and others on the future of work after COVID and wrote a report accordingly. And as you can see, they came up with 5 recommendations, and we'll actually be brainstorming around those 5 recommendations during the second half of the day. And we'll be wrapping up with remarks from Gary Cohen, our founder, and also the Chief Revenue Officer of AeroFarms. So with that, I am delighted to hand it over to the Dean of Rutgers Business School, Dean Lei Lei. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. And thank you all for joining us at this important event on future of work and corporate social innovation. As a top public business school in the Northeast, and as one of the largest in the nation, Rutgers Business School takes very seriously our responsibility to make positive changes in the world and to make our community a better place for all. Our commitment to social responsibility is demonstrated through many important initiatives directed by RIXI. And together with our supply chain management and PPCP programs, and under the strong leadership of our university, we are now working closely with the New Jersey Governor's Office and the 9 CEOs of the largest corporation in New Jersey to bring back 70,000 jobs by 2030. A large percentage of these newly created jobs will be devoted to underserved population to help make New Jersey a more equitable state. I'm very honored to introduce you the president of Rutgers University, Jonathan Holloway. Assuming this role as the president of a large research university in the nation during a time of unprecedented challenges and a global pandemic requires an exceptional leader with a courage, integrity, and strength. Rutgers is very fortunate to have Jonathan, and we are honored to have him with us today. Jonathan graduated with honors from Stanford and as an undergraduate, and then from Yale with a doctoral degree in history. He is an accomplished scholar, an eminent historian, and a visionary academic leader. He served as the dean of Yale College for several years, and more recently as a provost at Northwestern. He is also an elected member of the American Academy of Art and Science and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Great to have you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm happy to be part of this symposium exploring the future of work in a post-COVID era, an era I'm sure all of us hope arrives very soon. Won't be soon enough. I hope you'll allow me a moment to speak to the remarkable work that people across Rutgers have been doing since the pandemic began more than a year ago. Rutgers has been a leader in the medical and research front. You will all recall, I hope, that Rutgers was the first to develop a critically valuable saliva test for COVID-19 that has been employed millions of times over the past year, and also developing rapid tests for the virus and its variants. Rutgers has been a leader on the medical and research front by running clinical trials for 2 of the vaccines now in use, including the world's second largest clinical trial for the J&J vaccine. Brian Strom, the head of the Rutgers Biomedical Health Sciences unit, points to the second largest clinical trial. The only larger participant was Columbia, not university, by the way, but the country. This is how big this trial was. Rutgers has been a leader in the medical fields and science fields by conducting the largest study of healthcare workers in COVID in the country, and by being a regular resource for Governor Murphy and New Jersey state government in its response to this public health emergency. Even before the pandemic, and more than a year before I arrived, Rutgers has been involved in the Governor's Future of Work Task Force, looking at how innovations in technology will affect New Jersey and how we can prepare our state and its residents to thrive within these changes. Little did we know in 2018 how soon many of these technologies would come to the foreground. The world of work as we know it has changed. In my own case, it changed before the time I was appointed president last January and the time I took office last July. I mean, imagine, this is not just not about me, but imagine the transition. I was announced as the Rutgers president January 21st. Rutgers shut down in middle of March 6th of last year. And when I arrived on campus on June 25th to move into the president's house, it was my first time back on campus since my announcement. During that time, I discovered that a thing called Zoom existed that wasn't a public television show. And we all became incredibly reliant upon this and similar technologies. Now, I have only known the Rutgers presidency in a remote setting, which has many challenges to be sure, but also presented remarkable opportunities. It is difficult to be entering a university that I didn't know well before, at a time that the university is going through uncharted territory along with the rest of the country and the world. But you learn to adapt. You get things done in a different way, and you hope that some of these adaptations will inform the way you do business when things return to a new normal. I fully recognize that the pandemic has been much harder for some members of our society than for others. And sadly, but not unexpectedly, it has exposed and even exacerbated inequities. The hardest hit have been communities of color, low-wage workers, essential workers, and people without ready access to things many of us take for granted: affordable healthcare, a regular bank account, paid sick leave, childcare. But the past year has also afforded healthy businesses with the challenge to rethink how they operate, not only in making the shift to remote work, but also in the way that they interact with their customers, their communities, their workforce, and the larger society. The pandemic has called on them to demonstrate their commitment to social innovation. The Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, RICSI, explored how this pandemic has impacted the future of work and identified key areas where businesses can be socially innovative and positively influence their employees, their organization, and society. We are happy to have this opportunity today for a timely and relevant event that will explore the key issues regarding the future of work identified by RICSI in its recent report. And I thank all of you who will be contributing to this discussion. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, whom we are excited to welcome to this forum. Kathy Calvin is the former president and chief executive officer of the United Nations Foundation, which finds ways for companies and other organizations to help the UN address critical problems around the world. She currently sits on their board. She's a passionate advocate for multi-sector problem solving, US leadership on global issues, and the inclusion of women at all levels and in all sectors. During her tenure at the UN Foundation, Kathy led efforts to address global poverty, empower women and girls, create a clean energy future, and protect families in Africa from malaria, among other critical projects. Her career has spanned work in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Prior to her joining the UN Foundation in 2003, Kathy was the president of the AOL Time Warner Foundation, where she had responsibility for the corporation's philanthropy and its corporate responsibility initiatives. She served before that as senior managing director at Hill & Knowlton and as director of editorial administration for US News and World Report. And at the beginning of her remarkable career, she was Senator Gary Hart's press secretary in his Senate office and on his 1984 presidential campaign, one of the first women to hold that title in a presidential campaign. For these and so many other reasons, we are delighted to have Kathy Calvin with us today, and I'm pleased to introduce her to this conference. Thank you.
Well, thank you, President Holloway. That was a great introduction. And I have to say, your room is fantastic. I want to put it on the list of 10 rooms we all have to Zoom with. Very beautiful. And congratulations on all that Rutgers has done during this remarkable time, as well as through its entire history. You are well poised to be at that excellent institution at this critical time. And I wish you all the best for your tenure and for the work that you're doing to contribute to the future of New Jersey, but also our country and our world. So thank you. And Dean Lele, thank you for leading the business school. It's always awesome to see another woman in power and leading from strength to strength. And I'm delighted to be part of this with you. And I want to give a special shout out to Gary Cohen, the founder of the RIXI program. I have known Gary for maybe 10, maybe 20 years and admired so much his work, your work, Gary, in trying to expand the notion of global health and the role of the private sector in ensuring that global health truly is global and truly is defining health in some new ways. I'm in awe of all that you did in partnership with the United Nations, with the United Nations Foundation and me, and all this time. And I'm so happy to hear that you're off to a new adventure, but also still supporting this very important program. I also want to say congratulations to Noah Gaffney, the director of the RIXI program, and to all of you students for this remarkable paper. You guys did a killer job on it. It's really excellent. And I was so inspired reading it to think that you are going to be the future leaders, or as Muhammad Yunus on my board says often, no, not future leaders. You are the leaders of today and tomorrow. And that you're already taking on that mantle of responsibility and inspiration and passion. So I look forward to having this conversation with you because I want to dig a little deeper into some of the ideas you put forward, perhaps challenge you to think about some things that ought to be added to your list of challenges, and then think about what it's going to take for you to become the future leaders of tomorrow and to really design and live out the future work that we all want to have. So I'm really excited about today because the other thing that really hit me in preparing was that this is maybe the first opportunity since the Industrial Revolution for us to do a full reset on what work really means, both to people individually, to society, and to our economy. So designing the future of work is everybody's job, not just yours or mine or the company's, but everybody's. So I think you picked 5 really strong areas and they're spot on. And then we'll talk a little bit about what it's going to take to get there. So, you know, when Noah called me and asked if I would participate in this program and share some of my thoughts with all of you, I thought, well, this is ironic. I have just retired and there really is no future of work for me. But of course, that's not true. Our work is never done. And actually, it made me think that maybe I have a kind of a unique perch for thinking about what all of us can do to use this opportunity to make sure that the changes that became so clear during last year in tackling the simultaneous crises of our planet, injustice, our economy, our whole economic system, and our society. This is really the moment, and redesigning work is really at least one of the most significant answers. It's so obvious to me that the world of work that I knew is totally different than the world of work you will know. And so I'm excited to think about what we should leave behind and maybe what we should hold on to. I also started to think about my own children and the experiences that they went through during COVID and still are going through. My kids are both in their 30s. My daughter lost her job managing a small restaurant just as COVID hit. Obviously, it had to shut down. And she had to reinvent her skills, reinvent herself, and find a new way to work, actually without an employer. And she works remotely, and she's doing great. My son, who's in fulfillment, which is actually just another fancy word for working in a warehouse, packing the essentials that we all need, has kind of lived the other exciting part of this job thing. And that's that he's working in a job that barely pays a living wage. And that's not right. And there's too many people who got through this crisis either only on unemployment or with wages that just aren't adequate and sufficient. I think President Holloway mentioned this earlier. There's a serious issue there. So both of my children are kind of examples of what so many in our communities and our families experienced over the last year. And I'm sure many of your families have similar stories. So we have to bring this home before we can take it elsewhere. But then the third thing I thought about after thinking about my own terminated career, my children's challenges, I thought about the Sustainable Development Goals, which were created and adopted by 193 nations at the United Nations in 2015. Gary Cohen was a big part of that. Their goal was to make sure that this is a more equitable, cleaner, and just world by tackling 17 interrelated, universally challenging issues throughout every country. I mean, there is no country that has no violence against women. There is no country that can't do better on education. There's no country that can't do better on protecting the planet. Doesn't matter where you are, there's progress to be made. So this was the first attempt to have truly universal, interrelated goals that could change the world if we could get there. And they set a goal of 2030. So it was 5 years ago. Here we are, less than 10 years away from 2030. And so part of the future of work is really the future of ensuring that the work we do helps everyone around the goal, around the world, and that we're doing it in a way that is fair and just and regenerative. The reason I think everybody thought that could be done and should be done is that companies, communities, consumers all came together to say these goals were important and that they all had a role to play. And I think that's the exciting thing that we will talk about today. This is the work that I did throughout my whole career, and it's the unfinished work that you are going to take forward. So today, what I think would be valuable before you go into your working groups, which sound really exciting, is to review some of the challenges that we will face as we build back better. And thank you for using that term that was created at the UN, actually in the wake of the Haiti crisis, and the changes that need to happen. So I consulted a bunch of experts from Bill Gates to Arianna Huffington to Anand Giridharadas, and I have to thank them all for that. And I want to leave you with some observations about what you as future leaders have to do to ensure that the future of work tomorrow also meets the needs of today. So I want to start with some good news. Gary will not be surprised I'm starting with good news. There is wider recognition than ever that we need a reset. We need a reset to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. We need progress on the new restatement of corporate purpose, which has come up in the last few years as companies have recognized they need to do more than address shareholders. They need to address all stakeholders, and that all stakeholders are what today's capitalism is about. I don't know if you know Imperative 21, but it's an organization of a number of organizations that are all committed to a reset. And they define it this way. They say we need to design for interdependence, invest for justice, and account for stakeholders. I think this is going to require a broad network of private sector, government, and civil society, but we're having that conversation for the first time. So that's piece of good news number one. For the second time ever, and this just happened in the last couple of weeks, the Securities Exchange Commission, with such rules for companies on how they have to report on all kinds of issues related to their financial health, for the first time ever, have to report on their employees' health and mental health. So they've announced a disclosure requirement that companies manage not only their capital, but their human capital, how they attract, develop, and retain employees. This is historic because, employee well-being and mental health has always been an internal matter. Now it's a matter of external interest, and that is also part of the reset. And then third, this, employees and customers and young people are holding companies and their own employers accountable for holding values, for standing by them and demonstrating them with their actions. And they're reinforcing that new notion that the business of business is no longer just business. There's a thing called the Edelman Trust Barometer that measures every year the trust we have in different institutions. And the good news out of that is that there's a high expectation that companies can be part of the solution if they hold and articulate clear values, if they take actions to defend them. And that kind of expectation is higher than ever before, and young people are leading it. You are voting with your pocketbooks as well as your ballot box. And I think that's a really important change. But, and I think you all knew a but was coming, it's not going to be a slam dunk to make this transition because there's a lot of entrenched power that is doing just fine if we don't go with the transition. So I think to ensure that the future your generation wants, it's got to make some big breaks with the generation, with the work my generation built. And I'm for one all for that. So most of the research I've done, and I know you've done some great research with the extremely impressive companies that you had access to for your report. A lot of that research, conferences that are taking place like this one have all focused on how big companies are handling remote workers, how those workers are handling their new realities. Some of which are actually nice things, but some of which are difficult. That will turn off in a second, I'm sorry. But too little research has focused on the workers who couldn't be remote, who were considered too essential to stay home, despite the risks, and whose pay remains stubbornly low. And the disparate impact on women who have left the workforce in high numbers is still unaddressed, and many may be left behind even after the recovery. So this is an alarming tale of two cities, as President Holloway indicated. In our current situation, not everyone agrees on what building back better will look like and whom it should benefit, but we have to address that. So this is where I found your 5 areas of recommendations spot on. I love the concepts of brainstorming 3D versus 2D. I think you're so right on the importance of skill development to move up through a lattice and not just up a ladder, building your skills out, not just trying to move up, and the importance of reskilling for internal mobility. And I agree, pay will be only one measure of what we will judge to be important on whether work is meeting our needs. Every organization, whether it's profit or nonprofit, large or small, local or global, is going to have to dig deep in addressing the recommendations you've made. So some of the challenges I think we have to also bring into context here are the following. I've mentioned trust a couple times, and I think trust is something we've spent a lot of time thinking about this last year, and it's at the root of how we will come back better. Trust has to work in both directions. So employers will need to trust employees in new and different ways, whether they are remote, whether they're on site, or maybe they're hybrid. And employees will have to trust their employers to make decisions with transparency and compassion and integrity. The problem with truth is it's kind of invisible, but it's something that I think everybody feels every day, and it depends on knowing whether you trust that the other person is coming at the challenge with the same convictions you are. So we'll all have to work hard to earn each other's trust. Second, we actually have very few real tangible ways to measure the progress we're making, either toward the Sustainable Development Goals or against some of the recommendations you're making. It's been a good thing to see over the past 5 years how companies have aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals in their corporate statements, in their CSR, and even in their internal value definitions. But it's much harder to actually demonstrate progress and to measure results. So we're all going to have to come up with some new and different ways to understand that and to get people to sign on to making that hard decision. There'll have to be a new movement toward benchmarking or reporting on the kinds of investments we make in justice, environmental return, and long-term impact. And then there's all these other trends that are working against and setting the bar higher for what you're trying to do. Automation will continue to erode the number of jobs, steady pay, and even new opportunities. New technologies and even newer companies will have to be held to some of the higher standards, and sometimes they don't do that right off the bat. And global growth will definitely be uneven. Not everyone will benefit, even from the best ideas. And then finally, I just have to say, having been in the change-making business for my whole career, change-making eludes many of us because it's hard and it requires new habits, and it definitely requires new partners. Which brings me to you and your responsibilities and what you can do to be the leaders in the revolution in the future of work. So here's where Bill Gates comes in. He says there's 4 things. You need to cultivate curiosity and never stop learning. You need to have empathy and compassion, especially to empower those around you. You need to recognize not only your strengths, of which I'm sure there are many, but your weaknesses, and know when and how and to whom you can delegate them. And you need to focus on things that matter the most. That's really challenging in this world of indifferent things that are using up way too much of our attention to figure out what matters and focus. So I would add to Bill Gates, one, the skill sets of the future will depend on being collaborative much more than being competitive. You have to be unafraid to stand up, stand for, and speak out about your entire operation, corporation, organization, and not just the piece you are responsible for. That's hard for a lot of people, but that's essential. You need to develop the skill of recovering from setbacks. We all have them. And you need to work from a sense of purpose and meaning. That's essential. And sometimes we know it, but don't think about it as much as we should. And I would close by saying and adding and pleading that you would also lead from a commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals and be champions of the SDGs wherever you go, if it's to a company, to a nonprofit, starting your own work, whatever it may be. These goals will be the universal benchmark of progress, and they are the birthright of your generation. As Muhammad Yunus often says, in the future, you won't get a job, you will create a job, and hopefully you will create many jobs. So I'm excited to hear what you're thinking. I welcome any comments or questions, and I will close with a quote from my hero, Eleanor Roosevelt, who actually was the champion of not only the United Nations, but human rights back in the 1940s when she said, "The future will belong to those who believe in the beauty of their dreams." I know you all do, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Wow, Kathy, thank you so much for those fantastic remarks. Very inspiring as always. And we certainly appreciate you reaching out to a brain trust that includes Bill Gates and Muhammad Yunus and Ariana Huffington. So we're really grateful for all that wisdom from you and your peers. We have quite a number of questions, and I think instead of reading them out, I'm going to ask those who asked to read them out directly. And so we'll actually start with one of our students who was involved with the report, Mike Gendy.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you for taking my question. My question is more around those who are most impacted by COVID, say the bottom of the pyramid, quote unquote. How do we better incorporate them in building back better as compared to, leadership teams that have been probably unaffected or seen their wealth increase over COVID, making those changes and building back better? Like, how can we incorporate the pain and suffering of those that actually suffered compared to the leadership teams that built the system to begin with rebuilding?
Right on. That's a long-standing discussion within the development community, the community of people who have thought about what do we do to make sure we move the rest of the world out of poverty? And of course, the rest of the world includes places in our own country. How do we ensure that everyone moves up and everyone has opportunities? And the first and most central requirement is to listen and to learn and understand what they think, what their experience is, what their needs are. They know better than we do. They know better than any experts about what it will take to change in a small way or in a large way the situation and the opportunities they face. So for a long time, of course, in the development world, government assistance was based on what the developed world thought the developing world needed. And sooner or later, we began to listen to people who had lived in poverty and found new ways to break out of it. And it was often not the things that it looked like it was going to be. But so often we just don't listen and we don't include them in the conversation or bring them to the table. So the table has to be expanded. We have to have people there who are bringing in their own ideas about how to make change, people who will be benefiting the most from the changes that take place, and people who haven't been empowered to help make changes, but could be. So when you say we need to go beyond the leaders and the obvious top of the pyramid to include the bottom, I couldn't agree more. And the need is remarkable. I mean, one thing Bill Gates has been heard to say is that we lost 20 years of progress in bringing people out of poverty into prosperity over the past 20 months. I mean, that is horrific for people like Gary Cohen, who have spent their lives doing so much to give people the opportunities to have a future and a life and the prosperity that we all seek. So we've got some serious work to do. I'm quite worried about the distribution of the vaccine, as many people are, that it's going to be uneven. It's going to be slow to reach those in greatest of need. And it's something we all need to demand. But that same concept is the same one I would just urge to finish your question. We all need to demand that the changes we're making have to be inclusive, have to have careful thought about impact, and have to include all voices at the table. And I think if we learned one thing in 2020, it's that it's easy to not see what you don't know. And we're all having to learn some new ways about the life experiences that we haven't had for whatever reason, where we grew up, where we ended up. But it's not a luxury. It's a requirement that you learn about others and bring them along with you. I'm glad you're thinking that way.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kathy. We have another question from one of our students. Edith, would you like to share yours?
Thanks, Noah, and thank you, Kathy, so much for addressing us today. My question is, you referenced the Business Roundtable statement of purpose of the corporation and how it's expanded from shareholders to stakeholders. I was just wondering what you think about the actual implementation of that, or the extent to which companies are walking the talk. And I see another person put a related question in the chat right after mine. Art Esposito of Church and Dwight is asking, how do we accelerate the slow transition pace from shareholder primacy to true stakeholder capitalism, absent regulation as a driving force, particularly in the US?
Yeah, thank you both for that. It's this really serious issue. And I was so impressed reading the companies that you were able to include in your report. I mean, they are leaders and they're doing many of the right things, but there's sort of three categories of companies. There's those who really do identify with the opportunities that come with some of these changes and are putting things into place to make them happen. There are those who are going to say the right things and maybe add some new ideas, but they're pretty much going to keep on doing what they've been doing, particularly on the business side, as opposed to say the corporate social responsibility or the philanthropy side. And then there are those who are just not getting it, not hearing it yet at all, perhaps because the incentives aren't adequate. Not enough of us are demanding it, and transparency is really difficult to nail and get. So this is something that a lot of organizations are thinking about and talking about. At the UN, we talk about not wanting blue washing or greenwashing, or allowing companies to say something but not do something, to give a lot of money away to a community but actually not pay their workers the right amount. That the hypocrisies are going to have to come forward. What we can do, I think, as consumers is make some choices, as individuals who are in companies, to challenge and hope and push for a better and more robust commitment. Frankly, I love the Sustainable Development Goals. I wear my pin, but they aren't well enough known, and they need to be brought into more organizations, not just companies, but all organizations. Governments need to take their commitment to them much more seriously, and therefore put regulations in place. And I guess that's the final place. Until the incentives are put into policy that say it's as important to make sure we're building for the long term as for the short term. That is one of the biggest problems in the private sector today. Private sector quarterly earnings have to be so focused on the short term that we don't have the incentive. So it's going to take a range of all those things. But finally, I think it's going to take some leaders. I mean, and I've been really impressed with some of the leaders who have been willing to speak out and maybe put their companies at risk. The head of Danone was just let go by his shareholders because actually he was trying to make some of these changes happen. We need to stand by those people and help remind that they are really taking us in the direction we need to go, and that the short-term challenges will be outweighed by the long-term benefits. But all of this is to say it's really easy. I'll just say a final thing. I'm part of something called the World Benchmarking Alliance that got set up partly to say we need measures that not only companies can use to see how they're doing and compare with their competitors, but that average consumers can use to judge who's really walking the talk and who's not. And those are starting to come on board. It's about 2 years old, but I think increasingly that's the kind of thing that we need to push for and demand so that there's something real to talk about.
Absolutely. Art, do you want to share a follow-up question, just given your role as an executive in sustainability at Church and Dwight? I just wanted to see if you wanted to comment or reflect.
No, I think Kathy captured a lot of it well. This is a extremely deep and wide issue, right? And in the States, we are behind our European counterparts. We could sort of keel as to why that exists in terms of socioeconomic issues and all. I think, Kathy, you were saying something, especially around World Benchmarking Alliance. The whole shift in the private sector in this company needs to go from, I think, disclosure based. Yeah, we're doing this. We're not ESG, rater ranking, et cetera, being driven a lot around that, to true impacts and outcomes. And I think that's the only way you're going to really create that high level visibility for the key stakeholders, people in civil society, to make judgments on who's winning, how they're doing it, why it's important, and set that tone as leaders to create more inclusive environment, economy, and so on. And then there's this whole issue around intersectionality, around society, civil society existing in a good, functioning, sustainable planet. And that is a huge challenge also. So we have to look at everything as one, as you said, the intersectionality, the integration of all these very profound issues. So God bless UN for doing a lot of what they're doing. I don't have my pin on. I'll go get it on after the break, but thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks. And thank you for that. The intersectionality is actually one of the opportunities, but it's also such a challenge for people. You know, all of us have been so stovepiped in our thinking. And I mean, the good part to me is I had not heard the word intersectionality until 2016. And I heard it from a young person and I was like, what is that? And of course I knew about it. I mean, I knew, but I didn't know the word. But I'm so impressed that this generation thinks that way automatically. It doesn't even seem like a choice. Yeah. And so I think that's part of what gives me hope that the new generation of leadership that will come in with that mindset and not think as stovepiped as I think we've all been trained to do.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
We also have a question from Stephanie Werner regarding health. Kathy, what do you see as the role of a holistic approach to health and well-being as part of the transformation of the new work environment post-COVID?
Wow. I mean, if there's anything we've learned, it's how intersectionality and health are so critical. I was really impressed that the Secretary General of the United Nations has prioritized mental health as much as he has. The stigma around mental health, and I have it in my family, so I really think about this a lot, is so difficult and so troubling. But in truth, everyone suffers with some issue about mental health. We have our ups and downs, we have our challenges, we find things that are beyond our reach to comprehend or deal with. And the tolerance for sharing that at the appropriate times, for seeking help, and for analyzing how our structures either benefit or disrupt mental health in a community as well as individuals is just so ripe for a new era. And I mean, I was serious when I said that, this is maybe the first time since the Industrial Revolution. Well, the Industrial Revolution actually was horrible for mental health. It actually created a horrible amount of stress on what had been the way people approach their lives and the complexity and the wholeness of their lives. And this is kind of a really important time for a reset on that thinking. And, whether it's the issues around isolation or whether it's the issues around extreme poverty and the inability to take care of oneself and one's family, we have to be able to talk about those and to ensure that our government policies really are no longer just so top down, but actually much more holistic and inclusive. Those are going to be really hard. And I think this is an area that for the private sector and companies has kind of been just off their radar screen. They didn't have to think about it. And in fact, you were sort of told to leave your stuff at home when you came to work. I think that's no longer reality. So I think this shift and your inclusion of mental health and well-being in your recommendations actually is just so timely. I think you'll see a lot of support from the World Health Organization and other leaders in this space to give us the tools and the maybe even the vocabulary to talk about it in some new ways. I think Kamala Harris is frankly going to be a huge asset in this. I think just the one generation difference between her and President Biden, I think will open up some new conversations. I hope.
Thank you so much.
Turning it over to Ron from EY.
Sure. Kathy, it's been very useful, and I've worked with UN as well in consulting capacity. So very refreshing to hear your thoughts. My quick two-part question, I put one, but it's a why question and then the how. Why is around, the work reimagined, I lead the work reimagined at EY. It's all, it happens, we see that there is a compelling need to start. So I want to get your thoughts around why now? I mean, even this future of work and work reimagined has been there pre-pandemic, but now it has become more important and everybody talks, and I also talk about it. I want to get your thoughts from a UN perspective, from a broader perspective, why now? The second part of the question is, you talked about values, mental health, and I put that as how can we leverage this catalyst, the post-pandemic catalyst, to bring the equity, the diversity and equity baked in to what you call the business of businesses, not just business. How do we bring that into this? So I want to get your thoughts.
Well, those are great. I think why now is kind of like, why not now? But it's like a good disaster is something you never want to let go, or whatever that phrase is. I do think a lot of people had time last year to think about whether everything we were doing in our rat race was doing what we wanted, it was achieving what we wanted, was having the impact we wanted. So I think the door opened for some retrospection and inflection, introspection. But I think we also had the time to see some things that we just hadn't seen before. I mean, I am a believer that the George Floyd moment, had it happened in 2018, wouldn't have had the impact it had in 2020, because we all were glued to that, almost to the expense of everything else. And it became important in a way that it hadn't been before in our lives. It's not like it was new, that there was racial injustice or policing issues, but it was suddenly new in our lives in a way that just felt so much more real and tangible. And then suddenly we heard it from places that we hadn't been listening to. So I think something did happen in opening us up to each other. We saw each other in new ways. We saw essential workers in new ways. We saw our bosses in new ways. So I think that now actually is kind of one of those flukes of a moment. I don't know if that happened in 1918. You go back and think about that pandemic, but think what happened right after that. As the Roaring '20s, and some good things came out of that. But then you so smartly attached it to the not just the why but the how, and the how is the answer to everything. And that's where I think we have to all sort of dig deeper and challenge our thinking, because my instinct about how is sort of maybe old-fashioned things that we've seen work over the past 60 years or so, well, whatever. The how today is so different, and the how today is so much more immediate, because we see what happens around the world. We see individuals who wouldn't otherwise have had a voice on TikTok or wherever you're finding yourself and getting information. Our ability to see what a how could look like is so different. It's not all the same. It's not one or two things. It's pretty broad. So I think that actually will help. The challenge to me for leaders right now is kind of, it's almost so massive an opportunity, is to figure out where do you drive the change that you can most impact, while leaving your mind open for the inputs that you might not have noticed or known how to reach out to, and to put it in the hands of people you might not have known could handle it, to take it forward. So I do think spending time on how is probably, thank God EY is doing that kind of thing, is really, really important, and to just challenge us. We'll make mistakes along the way on this, and that's okay too.
Beautiful, thank you.
Thank you.
Turning it over to my colleague, Professor Gina Wartenberg, on reskilling.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm so inspired by your remarks and what we're creating together today. My specific question is, with all the challenges that we're facing through the SDGs, et cetera, how can companies balance the need to hire for the technical skills we need for the future and the equally important interpersonal core character skills, motivation, emotional intelligence, et cetera? And if you would please say what you think are the most important skills that are needed for the future. Big
Wow.
question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting point. Are those talent, skills, qualities equal in the kinds of people we need for the kinds of jobs we have? And it's a tough challenge. And it really, I think it goes to this reskilling question of, are people ready to be reskilled into some areas where they didn't have interest, let alone aptitude? And yet the needs are there. I feel like technology is actually going to help us here. Technology used to be difficult, challenging, and out of reach for many of us who didn't have an aptitude. Technology now is your friend and your partner, and it can help get us a little closer to opening up that door. But I think it takes a different kind of learning, and we have to invite people to come in and learn differently, and you know, have an ability to break out of sort of standard definitions of intelligence or aptitude or frankly job skills. Where I would put emphasis on hiring is people who are resilient, because I think as you reskill or as you branch out, you're going to have setbacks, you're going to have challenges that you couldn't anticipate. So that resilience is really critical. I think we have to prioritize people who are open rather than closed, and I can't stress enough the collaborative gene versus the competitive gene being really important at this time. That we do know teams work. We've always valued and admired individual achievers, and there will always be room for them because they can be. But I think in the future, the notion of how a team works together and is part of moving things forward is essential. And I don't think we've really gotten anywhere with understanding how teams get formed, get reshaped, get evaluated. I think a lot of that will be coming in the future. And then I guess finally, you know, if you don't have an appreciation for why you're doing something, it's really hard to get engaged in it. So I think to some degree, as companies broaden their definition of what their mission is, you know, when I worked for America Online, the tagline mission statement was something like enhancing the opportunities for engineers to create the best software or something like that. Well, that's okay, that's good. But we changed it to something more like creating a medium that is as accessible and universal as the television or the telephone, but even more valuable. And boy, did people suddenly get engaged and thought of themselves in new ways, even whether they were the programmers or whether they were the content producers. It changed everybody's thinking. So I think we just all have to kind of find some ways along. And I'll just say the last thing about reskilling, I don't know who's doing it really well. And I think it'd be useful to understand that.
Thank you. That's a wonderful answer. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And Kathy, if you don't mind, we'll take one last question.
Okay.
It's from another one of our students, Pranay, who also has a follow-up question around reskilling and inequality. So I'll let him ask that directly.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hi, Kathy. Thank you so much for giving all these remarks. I know you brought up reskilling within those. And my question is, often reskilling is thought about in the paradigm of trying to fix what automation has caused, which is this massive, like, sharp increase with like unemployment, particularly, and more importantly, like the decrease in labor force participation. But while that's been talked about a lot over the last few years, how do we bring that conversation and put it more through a lens of income inequality? Should we be doing that? And if so, how do we start redefining what reskilling should solve in that kind of scenario?
Wow, that's a great point, actually. Yeah, because it's not just about bringing those people into other jobs. It's really where does this take us, and what's the future we're trying to create for people as they have a new set of skills, which aren't always technical, but actually could be thinking skills, partnering skills, learning skills. So it's a really good point. You know, the inequity issue is so enormous. I mean, you probably know the statistic better than I do, but you know, in the 80s, the top corporate leader was several hundred or several times the lowest worker, and today it's thousands, although not in Europe. So there's that built-in inequity, I think, that is corrosive because it drives decision making, and it drives risk taking, actually. And so if you're not thinking about equity all the time, you're probably missing the boat on what you're doing. And I mean, I think it's a race issue, it's a poverty issue, and it's increasingly becoming a gender issue. I mean, we still have pay inequity. I think we just passed the pay inequity day this last week, something where women had to earn just to get to this point, just to be even with men. And it's worse for African American women and worse for women of all color. You know, this is just ridiculous at this day and age. But unless we're willing to talk about that and why it matters, and not just it matters and, you know, I should give up something so you have something. You may, in the end, doesn't a lot of this come down to power? So the broadening of the table, the recognition that broadening the table actually leads to better performance and better outcomes, and the commitment to kind of work on our way through it are just some things that have to happen. And there will be leaders who do it, but I think it's going to be constant conversation. I actually think the media is doing a far better job of keeping an eye on this issue than they used to, and that's something we can all welcome and learn from. But thank you for raising it, because at the end of the day, that's a good place for us to end, that there's so much better we could do. And really, isn't that what we're all here to do? And the future work will look good if it's good for everybody.
Kathy, thank you. I'm going to let Gary formally thank you, but I just am so grateful. I feel like my generation and this generation of students are really standing on the shoulders of giants, thanks to the work that you and your colleagues have done to widen the table and create the SDGs. And so just thank you so much for your insights. Thank you for joining us, and really thank you for your work to date. And I know you say you're retired, but I know that it is continuing. And so we look forward to continued updates. And so with that, Gary, if you just want to say a few remarks as well.
Well, thanks, Noah. And Kathy, you know, first, great to see you. It's great to be collaborating with you, even in your retirement. And I'm saying this with complete sincerity. We could not have found a better speaker in the world today to offer these keynote remarks than you. I think the clarity, the insight, and the wisdom that you shared with us, and spontaneously for most of it, you know, you weren't reading from a script, and everything you said resonated to the purpose of today's event. And I want to point out there's 118 people now in this meeting, in this event. And if they're looking for a role model, you know, I had the privilege of seeing you in action in New York at the UN, in Geneva, at the World Health Assembly. And that was work you did throughout the world, always surrounded by world leaders, by leaders from countries throughout the world. You had tremendous influence. And yet, as you evidenced again today, with incredible characteristic modesty. It's a remarkable set of character traits and absolute integrity. And I think everyone in this event should be role modeling what they witnessed in your speech today. And I hope we're going to have continued opportunities to collaborate. You have so much insight to offer to this institute, which is still relatively young and has a lot of potential for positive impact. And I just want to share personally what a pleasure it's been through the years to collaborate with you. And I'm looking forward to much more of that as your time permits in retirement. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. Thanks. And congratulations again.
Thank you.
And I'm going to stick around to hear the reporting at the beginning.
Thank you so much. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to our students. Thank you, Kathy, for staying on as well. I know they'll be really grateful to have your presence. As you all know, our students, this whole initiative came about because our students created a task force that began last summer, focused on the future of work after COVID-19. And of course, when this initiative first launched, we were still in the midst of COVID-19. And now that we continue to see the light at the end of the tunnel, so much has changed, and these students have done a fantastic job of not only pulling together a report, but making sure that their insights today are current. And we look forward to continuing the conversation afterwards with brainstorming sessions. But at the moment, I'd really like to turn it over to our students so we can hear a few words from them about how this report came about and what they've discovered. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to the project manager for this task force, Edith Orenstein.
Thank you, Noah. As Noah mentioned, we formed a task force of 10 members of the Student Advisory Board of the RIXI, and we met weekly throughout the summer. The first thing we did was to do secondary research to get a grounding in the subject matter, and our task force of 10 students reviewed 100 articles in total. The resources were things like consulting firms, publications like McKinsey, organizations such as the Society of Human Resources Management, government publications from the CDC, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the Fed. We also reviewed publications of the World Economic Forum and the UN, and academic journals, including the Rutgers Business Review, Harvard Business Review, and others, as well as the popular press, and throughout the time, of course, looking at the statistics of the Johns Hopkins COVID tracker and so forth. After we did the secondary research, we actually met weekly and discussed what we were learning. We then moved into the next phase, which was primary research, where we interviewed executives from leading companies to talk about what they were doing in this field of corporate social innovation to address the challenges of COVID and the future of work. The companies that we interviewed included large companies and small companies. These companies included Audible, Merck, Panasonic, Samsung, Subaru, Verizon, as well as Mobility Capital Finance, or MoCaFi, and One Huddle. And throughout this, we tied together again the RIXI's 4 pillars of corporate social innovation, including corporate social responsibility as relates to sustainability and social impact, strategic philanthropy and volunteerism, advocacy and public policy, and shared value creation. So after basically drafting our report with the secondary and primary research and meeting weekly, we came up with 5 recommendations for going forward. These are our 5 recommendations, which student members of the task force will go through briefly individually. They included supporting employee mental health, reskilling for the long term, educating for tomorrow's workforce, sustainability in the environment, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm now going to lead to Claire Sue, one of my colleagues, who will talk about the first area.
Thank you, Edith. So new research indicates that employees are putting in more hours than ever and experiencing burnout and exposure to additional stressors. A global 2020 study by Oracle and Workplace Intelligence found that 76% of people believe companies should be doing more to support the mental health of their workforce. 70% have had more stress and anxiety at work this year than any previous year, and 85% say their mental health issues at work negatively affect their home life. So a more remote future of work needs transformational infrastructure that ensures a baseline of employee mental health in addition to personal and professional development. This can be achieved through internal opportunity and communication. For example, we found that MoCaFi's pandemic HR changes focus on tackling the barriers of a 2D world. This included goal setting and appraising tool in place of interpersonal recognition, daily phone calls in place of informal conversations, and more frequent virtual town halls. Similarly, Samsung's future of work vision focuses on balancing the pros and cons of remote work. While time spent commuting may be saved, virtual brainstorming is inefficient. The vision involves spending 3 days per week in the office. The time in the office would be used for ideation and collaboration with individualized work completed elsewhere. So it will be a gradual process as executives continue to reflect on the positives and negatives of the current environment and what can and cannot be achieved purely through digital tools. And Pranay will now introduce our next topic.
Thank you, Claire. So we're currently in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution. So automation has been going on for quite a while now, but COVID-19 has acted as a sharp catalyst in reducing both blue-collar manufacturing jobs and repetitive task white-collar jobs. There's also been shown to be this very strong direct correlation between employment status and civic engagement. And with the civilian labor force participation rate on a consistent decline, we believe that every single stakeholder in America has a part to play in ensuring that we can restore jobs in this country, as well as moving forward, ensure that we can continue to create that social cohesion that we unfortunately at the moment may not have as much of. So moving forward from here, there are luckily two ways where corporations can engage with both shared responsibility and reskilling. And they can do this internally through creating programs for reskilling to ensure that they can meet their own high demands for technical and soft skills and then train employees to match those. They can also do it externally through engaging in philanthropic activity. And this can be done to help more of the public and nonprofit sectors and reskilling the general population. Reskilling has three big advantages to it. One is to give opportunity to many other employees, that both being internally and externally. For internal employees, it allows them to become more well-rounded, expert generalists, because they are now being trained to do something that they previously were already an expert in, but being engaged in more areas of a business, which then promotes internal mobility and loyalty to a company. It also, from an external perspective, enables mobility and heightened job prospects, and this can be then impacted across the country as a whole. The great thing about mobility and reskilling is that it works in other factions of corporate social innovation, and diversity is one of the big factors. Internal mobility helps preserve diversity recruiting. Over the past few years, the beautiful thing about diversity is that a lot of companies have gotten really good at ensuring that at a base level, they're able to bring on diverse talent. The real challenge now has been to engage with that diverse talent and make sure that they stay on, which has not been successful across the board. With reskilling and internal mobility, they could preserve this diversity and allow them to have more diverse upper levels of management and a stronger permeation of a diverse culture. Last but not least, investing in reskilling is an investment into your own employees. So while it may be a one-time initial investment, it could then cut down future recurring costs that come with a lot of hiring, firing, and other premiums that you have to pay when it comes time to kind of bring on new employees to fit new demands. I'm now going to bring it on. I'm not going to pass this on to Kushi to talk about educating for tomorrow's workforce.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Pranay. The importance of educating the future generation is crucial, especially in a time where attaining important skills has become challenging for a handful of them. When we think about important skills at companies and at work, interpersonal skills and teamwork really stand out alongside communication skills. With COVID-19, the majority of the students in the country are found staring at their laptops under remote teaching. And so the importance of providing professional development to these students by companies is that much more important. But how can we do that? The first step would be to get more involved in philanthropy in order to actually provide students with the technology they need in order to be at the same level as their peers. This would also provide students with access to educational resources, from important courses to skill development programs. And when we think about the pillars of corporate social innovation, especially shared value creation, by designing recruitment and training programs that supply shared impact, companies could provide more professional development opportunities such as externships and internships so that students can gain a better insight into what working in an actual organization is like while developing those hard and soft skills on the job. And these are skills that they can actually transfer over into the workplace. And finally, partnerships with schools to facilitate all of this is incredibly important. It is crucial that companies stay engaged with teachers and students in their area, given the virtual setting that we are in. For example, many Audible stories were made available for free to take a step forward in removing those barriers when it comes to access for families dealing with the challenges and the challenging times in the era of COVID-19. I'll now pass it over to Lori Donnelly, who will be speaking on sustainability and the environment.
Thank you, Kushi. Building back stronger for a sustainable future means building a regenerative economy to ensure resilience toward future events, which means having an economy that works to regenerate goods and services that are needed for community well-being. Maintaining a focus on sustainability and the environment is challenging, particularly during times of crisis. However, it's important to remember that crises are recurring and they include climate, nature, and health-related events. We also have to recognize that multiple futures are possible. And with that, we need to identify and consider alternative directions and actions that could be taken. During the pandemic, we were presented with some evidence about sustainability and the environment. We saw air quality satellite maps improve dramatically, and we also saw that 70% of emerging infectious diseases come from animals. We increased the potential spread of viruses like COVID-19 by exposing workers to them through environmental activities like logging or mining. Playing an active role in rebuilding communities, goes hand in hand with environmental actions, like investing in renewable energy and engaging with policymakers so they're encouraged to adopt a sustainable mindset. On to the next slide. Regenerating communities and the economy is also not just about guarding nature, it's about shifting societal norms, creating value beyond restoration, and moving toward attaining net zero, which means consuming only as much energy as produced to achieve a sustainable balance between availability and demand, while eliminating waste. Reducing our waste footprint requires coordination among corporations at multiple levels to avoid silos, and increased government advocacy and funding, with a focus on nature-based climate solutions, clean power, clean mobility, and zero carbon infrastructure and technologies. It's through these efforts that we can help ensure resilience toward future events similar in scope to the global pandemic. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Aditya Palekar, to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you, Lori. And for the final topic is diversity, equity, inclusion. The essence of it is that companies can use COVID-19 to build back better. So we check out the graph on the right. It's shown that the diversity or the ethnic diversity of the workforce in the US, with about 57% white and about 13.29% Asian and 9.85% Black, we believe that the workforce can become more diverse. And upon talking with these business executives, we found out that the commitment that the business have are that they need to change, have a cultural change for the future of work. This includes the cultural change in the diversity of suppliers, in the internal development and recruitment, and a range of background experiences that they're hiring. In addition, they also spoke about the philanthropic resources that must go back towards fighting for diversity, equity, and inclusion. They also spoke about the gender inequality, but more specifically about the woman's role and being felt like they belong in the workforce. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19, some of the women's roles have been set back a little bit as everything's moved online. However, the commitment from the businesses is that they will try and combat that expertise. And the final part is the cultural diversity, in specific, the racial inequality that we face in the United States. After many of the movements of 2020, many of these companies believe it's a time for a change. And as Panasonic finished off, they claim to say that the future of workforce is people of color. So I now turn it back to Noah to finish off the presentation.
Thank you, Aditya, and thank you all. If you all could just join me in virtually clapping for our students. They worked so hard on this presentation. As we mentioned, this has been something which has been ongoing for almost a year, and they've done a fantastic job of assessing the landscape, interviewing leaders in this space, and really coming up with concrete recommendations for how organizations can build back better. And I think they touched upon the zeitgeist in many ways. And, building on Kathy's remarks earlier and the remarks of President Holloway and Dean Lay, it's clear that this is something which we are passionate about locally as well as globally. And so with that, we are going to hand over to brainstorming session. So this is really the interactive component of today, and we'll actually be turning over to students and have a corporate champion for each session, as well as a faculty facilitator for each of the 5 breakout areas. And many of you have expressed your preference in advance, but if not, we're just going to put you into one of the rooms randomly. And so with that, I'll just announce who each of the breakout leaders are. So the first one is supporting employee mental health. And we are grateful to have Erin Byrne, Senior Director of Corporate Sustainability and Social Impact at one of our corporate partners, Novo Nordisk. Thank you so much. And our faculty lead will be Dr. Gloria Backman, who is really just a force in this space, Director of the Women's Health Institute at RWJ Medical School. And our student lead will be Claire, whom you heard from previously. For reskilling for the long term, we're delighted to have Sam Couchy, the founder and CEO of One Huddle, and the faculty lead will be Professor Gina Wurtenberg, who is the Associate Director for the RICSI, as well as a professor at Rutgers Business School, and we'll be hearing from Pranay as the student lead. For Educating for Tomorrow's Workforce, we're thrilled to have Ann Wu, who is the head of corporate citizenship at Samsung, another one of our corporate partners. Thank you so much for your partnership. And we'll be partnering with Sharon Leiden, who is the associate dean, as well as the student lead Kushi. So thank you all so much for that. For sustainability and environment, we have another corporate partner, Eliza Gonzalez from Johnson & Johnson in their procurement function, speaking about sustainability and environment, along with our academic director, Professor Mike Barnett, and Lori. And finally, for diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are thrilled to have Aisha Thomas Petit, who is the Chief Diversity Officer of AMC Networks, as well as faculty lead Carbon Bonilla, who's an assistant professor at RBS, and Aditya, whom you recently heard from. And so we will have approximately 40 minutes for these breakout groups. We will come back at 11 a.m. to wrap up, share insights from the faculty leads, and really have a full group discussion based on these insightful and deep conversations that you'll be having. And so thanks to our program coordinator, Deborah, we will be moving over into those breakout groups now. Thank you all so much.
I think the first was that we thought corporations have to redefine professionalism, because that if any leader or employee expresses mental distress, that could looked upon as negative for their leadership skills. So and that mental health issues are not visible. Like if you are mentally stressed, there's nothing that one can see with that. And again, just reporting that you've had a mental issue is not like saying you've had a heart attack, that people really do look upon you more negatively. That we really looked at all of the ways that the corporate world is addressing the issues of mental health. And Erin, you want to just go into some of the corporate ways that it's being done?
Sure, absolutely. So we talked a little bit about the need to have just very frank conversations, right? I think we spoke also just about how it's almost becoming the norm to be open, to be vulnerable about the situation you're in. And so from a leadership and managerial standpoint, it's being, Gloria's point, professional and kind of putting that face on and leading by example, right? To show your respective employees that it's okay. It's okay not to be okay. And we need to work together on making sure your situation is, one that's going to suit you. So it's kind of down to that two-way street from an employee that be able to be vocal and stand up and say, hey, I'm not comfortable with whatever it may be, or I'm struggling with this. What resources does the company have available to me? But also leading by example from a managerial standpoint and being sure that you're funneling that down from the way that you're managing. I just mentioned a couple of times with my team, I had to really respond to them and remind them, go take lunch away from the computer, right? We talked a little even in the group about Zoom fatigue, the benefit of getting away from the computer and going outside for a walk, and what a 10-minute conversation can do from a connectivity standpoint, but also from a mental health standpoint. There was discussion about the employee resource groups and how important they are and have been, and kind of continuing to rise to the top even more for organizations, for both employees to lean into, but also for a leadership and managerial standpoint to lean on for resources as well. And then, the volunteering part, which is kind of key to my heart, which is just, a quick plug to say there's proven benefits from a mental health and employee engagement standpoint for volunteering and for organizations supporting employees in that way. So even from a virtual standpoint, there's a lot of opportunities there. And at Novo Nordisk, we've seen that, be a tremendous break from the day, but also employee engagement standpoint.
Fantastic. Thank you both. Let's turn it over to the reskilling group.
Hi, everybody. Gina here. We had a fantastic, robust conversation, and it culminated in what we think is an amazing idea that was generated during the group. So hold on to your horses, and I'll share that in a minute. The first thing we discussed was how companies need to invest in a whole infrastructure ecosystem that allows for technology that's equitable and a pathway with an access to training for everyone. The second thing we talked about was that it needs to be continuous. We talk about lifelong learning, but it has to be 52 weeks a year all the time. And the role of government. We talked about how the Fair Labor Standards Act and the tax code is completely outdated relative to training. Much of it was before the internet was even existed. We also talked about how companies need to rethink their hiring practices so that they're not hiring people for the exact job, but training people for the exact job and hiring them for the broad basic skills, the interpersonal soft skills, et cetera. And instead of waiting for the perfect candidate to appear, to take chances on people that are smart, motivated, resilient, emotionally intelligent, and perhaps for a temporary probationary period. So that led to a conversation about how we could create an ecosystem to have access to people, and what's the role of the organization, what's the role of the provider organizations, what's the role of the individuals. And we also talked about the fact that the first thing that usually is cut is training in organizations. And as a former HR director, I can attest to that. And the other hand, there's unused money. People don't use the money. So there's money in the department budget, but people don't use it because they're not looking, and they don't have a climate of development for development culture. So we have a challenge, a giant challenge, but we also have a giant opportunity. And our big idea, drum roll, is to create a learning and development savings account for training, similar to with matching funds from companies, similar to possibly the infrastructure for the 529s. And people carry this portable account across companies through their lifetime to invest in their own lifelong training and infrastructure. It could be like an IRA. So it supports all of the challenges that we just talked about, and it would need involvement from business, government, and certainly the individual who would actually control their own development. And this would be for everyone. So it could be a chef who's been, lost their job in a restaurant, and they might want to retrain for a completely different kind of skill. Sam, would you like to add a few words to what I just summarized?
Gina did a great job. The panel was super high energy. I think that one of the things I took away from the group was the necessity and the urgency with which we need to create better opportunities for individuals that want to be proactive and take agency in their own development, whether that's providing guidance and what programming makes sense. What is the right path? Should I go to a technical school or a community college, or are there other solutions out there today that we should take advantage? And also, how does government provide the cushion so that people can that may want to take advantage of dollars can do that and not fear debt or missing a rent payment or who knows what, because they just want to get a fair shot at career development.
Great.
Thank you both. I think that's a great lead into the next group, which is educating for tomorrow's workforce. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Anne and Sharon.
Thank you so much, Noah. Thanks for Anne. And we also had a very lively discussion. We talked about the loss of ability to interact, and we're going to have to relearn and reacclimate to that. People are having trouble being fully present with no boundaries at work and home, and that there is a real opportunity to reskill and be more inclusive in providing access to technology and Wi-Fi. We talked a lot about experiential learning, how important that is for college students and high school students, and externships, and big challenges. This was Art's quote: big challenges need big collaboration. So we also had Tammy, who was on a school board, tell us that we need to empower parents and the government and corporations and schools. Everybody's in this together to try to break through the regulations and the bureaucracy to try to get things done. And I like Anne, she used a great word that really resonated with me, like leapfrog, like let's really make a big change. Anne, would you like to add anything?
Sure. I think for a lot of companies, sometimes we like to see what others have done first, like having a best practice and a benchmark, but sometimes you have to go first. And I really liked Art's challenge to say that, sometimes someone has to go first, take the lead, and really put ourselves out there to really start to build those best practices, show the example so that others can be part of the conversation. And so I think that and we also talked a lot about inclusivity. And I think that when we talk about the future workforce, that there is a huge opportunity. In fact, I think it is a requirement for us to think about who is the workforce. It's not the top 10% who are succeeding anyway, but how do we bring everyone along and even pay special attention and focus to those who would otherwise be left behind in part of this conversation. It's a great discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you both. Wonderful. And now I'll turn it over to the Sustainability and Environment Group.
Thanks. Yeah, we had the great misfortune of having some fascinating executives in our group. So we were mostly trying to learn more about what J&J is doing and learning within our group. We also had Unilever represented, and so we got some fascinating insights for our own internal discussion. But we were able to come away with some takeaways as well that I think we can share with the group. And it's really focused around supply chain management. So when you want to improve environmental performance, you have these extensive supply chains at many companies. And so nowadays it's really about, efficiently and effectively managing that supply chain, which in this era is actually quite difficult because a lot of the suppliers were in jeopardy of failing during the downturn. And so you actually have to up your investment in managing these relationships, but you need to do it in a very efficient and effective way. You need to streamline that international complex network of suppliers, a very complicated thing to do, also a very costly thing to do. J&J is investing heavily in making that a much more efficient network. But as you make that more efficient and effective, and so more environmentally responsible, you run against the problem that, this mess is probably more the new normal now. We're going to have a continuing series of cascading crises. I mean, this is what we have to face all the time. And so what you actually need to build into the supply chain also is resilience and redundancy. And that comes at the cost of efficiency and effectiveness. And so there's the rub. We don't have great answers on how to do that other than to point out that that's a complicated issue. But the insights we do have is that you need to treat your suppliers as partners, as collaborators, not as enemies, not as combatants. And you need to treat them as an investment, not as a cost to avoid. So if you look at long-term and look at growth potential and the ability to make the most of these relationships, including being more environmentally responsible after these downturns, then you need to see it as the investment that it is and put forth the time and effort and the money at a time when it's actually very hard to do. Eliza?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think the other theme that came up in addition to everything you said is that idea that this is an area where we don't compete with other corporations. It's just not a place where, you have those boundaries. And I think, with Johnson & Johnson, even partnering with Merck, right, to ensure that our vaccine gets out to more people than we could do ourselves is one example of that. I brought up the example of us being part of the Business Roundtable, which is, our CEO is part of that. And, they have a purpose of the corporation. And about 180 plus companies, came together and said, yes, we agree that this is, what we must do together as partners in this. So I think in addition to the supplier partnerships, it's also corporation partnerships that we have to make sure that we lean on each other for this.
Thank you, Liza. And of course, J&J is well known for its diverse suppliers initiatives. And so I think it's a great lead into the DEI conversation that was had. And so Carmen, Aisha, if you guys would like to share your thoughts.
Yes, thank you. So in our group, we had really good brainstorming and discussion in identifying the very diverse components of the challenges of DEI. And I think one of the takeaways from this conversation is this requires a pretty broad thinking, the widening of thinking regarding this. We mentioned, things like disability and including caregivers. How do we create a DEI culture? How do we assess the true commitment to D&I? And it was mentioned the popularity that this topic has had since last summer. And so, how do we measure against a true commitment against it? We also mentioned the topic of women in business and biases against women, just to mention a few of the challenges. So we saw that it's very broad and the list is very long. Some things that corporations can do to make an impact included some things mentioned by Aisha, providing programs for career exploration for young people, focusing on the development of talent once it's inside the organization. Remembering that people want to be connected to organizations that do more than just profit, that are focused on a greater purpose. It definitely pays off. And getting to the root cause of the problems, we have seen also companies working with HBCUs and getting more involved philanthropically. Bearing in mind your location and making sure that there's access to transportation. Here we're thinking about people who may experience difficulty getting to a company, to some facilities. Aisha, would you like to add?
Thank you, Carmen. You captured a good chunk of our conversation. It was a pretty rich discussion. The only thing that I will add is that we spent some time talking about the inability to compartmentalize DEI. We're experiencing so many attacks, for lack of a better term, on progress to DEI that we've really got to pay attention, and corporations have to pay attention to the intersecting nature of some of these challenges. And I think I heard that participating or listening in to some of the earlier discussions, but having intersectionality as part of the strategy corporations take is around DEI is really important.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And so with that, just really fantastic conversation. I'm going to hand it over to the founder of the RIXI and the Chief Revenue Officer of AeroFarms, who is having a very big day today, Gary Cohen, and he could wrap up and summarize the day. So thank you so much, Gary.
So I'm just going to start by thanking the core team at the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation. The core team is Noah, Deborah, Gina, and Mike. And I know from experience, when an event is incredibly successful, it looks easy. You know, everything goes flawlessly. You say, hey, that couldn't have been too hard because there didn't seem to be any hiccups. The only way that happens is when all the hard work is done so exceptionally well. And this was an incredible event. I feel privileged to have been a part of it today. And yes, Noah, the company I'm with now went public today. So it was kind of a big day in general, but I'm glad I was able to participate in both of those key activities. I want to thank President Holloway and Dean Lay for their inspiring remarks. You know, it strikes me, Rutgers is older than the United States. It's older than our country, yet it's on the leading edge of such an important and universally relevant subject as the future of work. I mean, this literally affects every person, every working person, every family in the world. So this is a highly relevant event, and Rutgers is on the leading edge. I want to thank again Kathy Calvin. She's an incredible leader, someone I'm privileged to know. And as I already mentioned, she possesses a combination of leadership influence, integrity, and personal modesty that all of us can aspire to. So I personally hung on every word of her remarks. And in addition to the wisdom she shared with us, just the example she sets through who she is and what she's accomplished is something we can all learn from. And I just want to provide a perspective on the year 2020. You know, I'm old enough to remember the year 1968 vividly. And that was a really tough year. I would say, other than, let's say, being in the midst of World War II, 1968 was a really tough year, at least for the United States. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and then Robert Kennedy, who was going to be destined to be the next president, was assassinated. It changed the direction of the world. And it led to, understandably, an outpouring around racial injustice and the impact of racial injustice that also changed the direction of the country. So we were forced as a country to respond to that. And then I think about 2020, where we had the dual impacts of a global health pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, that literally changed our lives. And yet again, catalysts and triggers that brought underlying racial injustice forcibly to the surface and needed to be dealt with. And everything was disrupted. Our jobs, our workforces, the way we work, our supply chains, service delivery, everything was disrupted. And I have to say, companies really stepped up out of necessity. You know, frontline workers in particular made the continuation of our lives possible. If we didn't have, you know, food in our supermarkets and in our delivery from restaurants and delivery services, operating under strife, particularly the restaurants, if we didn't have frontline health workers who not only had to care for those who were affected by COVID and infected by COVID-19 under the most difficult conditions, particularly in the early months, but still had to do surgeries, still had to have, you know, assist mothers in giving birth. Our lives would not have been able to continue without these frontline workers. And it's not just them, you know, energy workers that gave us power in our home, the workers who enable us to have Wi-Fi so we can run events such as this. Companies really stood up. And then even beyond that, the innovation that came through companies. You know, let's not forget that vaccines were developed and new diagnostics for COVID-19 in a fraction of the time that they otherwise could have ever been developed at any other time in history. So here's the challenge in my view. You know, companies were catalyzed and in some cases forced into corporate social responsibility. They knew they had no choice, and they did a great job. And this is coming on the heels of trends where companies already, in my opinion, the business sector has probably become more progressive. I'm saying probably just so no one disagrees with me too much, has become more progressive than the public sector has. If you think about issues of equity, there's still a lot that has to be done. No mistaking that. But companies have been on this trend and now forced to step up. And here's the key question. Will companies continue with this? Because it'll be in their interest to do so. There's no doubt that customers want to deal with and will be loyal to companies that have positive societal impact. And ESG investors are not going to invest in companies unless they have the environmental, social, and government standards and practices that they're expecting. So hopefully this is going to be a step function catalyst for companies to continue with these types of practices and build them into their business models. And that's, what the RICSI, we call for short the RICSI, the Rutgers Institute for Corporate Social Innovation, can really help with. We're kind of right at the state of the art in advancing these practices, inculcating them with our student populations, whether they're full-time students or executive education, and partnering and collaborating with companies and with other sectors to advance these practices. So I really encourage you, become involved. You've seen today the type of impact this kind of event can have on such an important issue. I know Noah and the team are standing by, ready to engage with you if you're so inclined to do so. And we have great companies, as represented in this event today, already closely engaged. So again, thank you all for engaging and participating. Thank you, Noah and team, for organizing this event. Thank the speakers. And let's, take this to new heights. We have the impetus to do so now.
Thank you so much, Gary, and thank you all for joining us here today. We will be sending out a summary as well as the recording of this event, so please stay tuned. And as you all know, this is the start of an ongoing conversation, and so please stay tuned as we continue to undertake programming related to the future of work as we move through and hopefully past COVID in the months to come. So thank you all again. I appreciate your time and your energy today, and just join me once again in thanking the speakers and the students.
Thank you, everyone. Great job, Noah.
And team, thank you.
And team.
Thank
And
you, Noah and
Deborah.
team. Yeah.
The whole team and the whole, all the students. And thank you, Deborah. Fabulous.